Pharma Ventures, experts in deals and alliances.
Hello and welcome to Pharma Television News Review here in Oxford in England. On this show I have Melissa Hillier, who is Assistant Director at Genetic Alliance UK, and also with her is Jessica Burke, who is the Project Manager at Genetic Alliance UK. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
May I start with you, Melissa? Obviously, Genetic Alliance says something about what you do. Tell us what the purpose of Genetic Alliance is. We know it's a charitable organisation. What's its purpose?
Our purpose is to work from the perspective of our member organisations. We have over 150 different charities that fall under our alliance, and we work together to ensure that the patient voice is heard in key debates, not only in the UK, but also in Europe as well.
Okay. So obviously, most people are aware that there are quite a number of different genetic diseases. All of them only in common the fact that they're genetic, but also all have different effects on the patients, of course. So the purpose then, as you just said, is to really unify that voice into a single voice. So that means that obviously working closely with those organizations is important, but your communication, obviously one of the key forms of communication is the advocacy particularly into government. So how does that work?
Absolutely. So as you said, there's a lot of rare genetic conditions. We know there's over 6,000 rare conditions and 80% of those are genetic. So we have a broad scope really. What we try and do is bring together the common themes and issues that patients and family have and feed that into key debates within government. We do that through a number of means, a number of channels, particularly, for example, responding to government consultations about issues around genetics, where, key issues that sometimes maybe patients and families don't know about, in terms of don't know whether there's a consultation happening, but also whether some of our member organisations are very small and they may not feel they have the capacity or the ability to respond to some of these consultations. And we also sit on a number of as a patient representative on a number of boards and governing bodies, again, making sure that the voice of those affected by genetic conditions is heard in sort of the heart of debates that are taking place. And I think the good thing about Genetic Alliance UK is we can speak from the perspective of a whole group of different conditions. And although the conditions themselves are very different, the issues are often very similar.
Indeed. And of course, communication to government is an important thing. There is always change going on in the healthcare system. But equally, the science is changing, there are new improvements, so communication back to patients as well. So how does that work?
Absolutely, science is changing all the time. Genetics, when we were first set up over 20 years ago, was a very, very niche area that maybe only a few conditions fell under, but now it's much broader. Communicating the scientific side of things is often very difficult because the issues are complex, the science is complex, and we actually find communicating those issues back to patients, but also to MPs and to civil servants is complicated when people don't have a scientific background. We've tried very hard to produce patient information around technical issues. We've also produced some novel cartoons that explain some of the very complex issues such as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis in simple terms so that people can understand that and then make informed decisions about that new technology. So actually those cartoons are very useful for our membership, but also for some of our campaigning and policy work as well.
Right, so education is key.
Absolutely.
And that brings us on to you, Jessica, because you're a project manager of one of the initiatives that's been taken within the Genetic Alliance UK, and that is the route maps for rare diseases. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that initiative.
So this is a Department of Health funded project that has supported 10 of our member groups to create a condition-specific route map. And based on those experiences, we've created a toolkit, a step-by-step guide basically for other groups to then be able to create their own route map. Okay,
so just tell us a little bit more about that, because obviously if I had a child that was affected, for an example, with a particular rare genetic disease, these route maps help patients who belong to that particular group mm-hmm. to understand the best way in which they can get access to care, support,
That's right.
education,
So it's basically a comprehensive guide signposting patients and their families to help them improve access to information and care. It looks at more than just a medical pathway, it also looks at social care, education and support in the workplace. Anything that's really relevant to the condition.
Right. So to better understand that, I suppose, clearly for most patients, these things come as a shock, the fact that their child may have a genetic disease and so forth. So there are emotional issues, there are social issues, there are political issues. So your route map helps them to understand the way forward for them to ensure that their relatives or themselves are better looked after and cared for.
Yeah, so it depends on the condition. Each of the groups have really looked at what's impacted on them. So some have really focused on the medical aspect, others have looked at more of the social and counselling side, as that's something that they feel is more important and affects their patients more than the medical aspect.
Right.
It really looks at it from diagnosis through to long-term care and maintenance really of a condition.
Right. And of course, because you created a toolkit, which is basically a template for each other charity who's focused in a particular disease area, shows that they're not all the same. They're quite different. Is that right?
Yes, and when we picked the 10 pilot groups, we really tried to look at a lot of different conditions. So we made sure that we had a congenital condition, a late onset condition, neurodegenerative condition, just because there's different obstacles that each condition faces, and we wanted to make sure that we, with this toolkit, were able to help every group that wanted to create a route map.
Right. So going back to you, Melissa, we're talking here a little bit about obviously the impact. Obviously, it has to be on patients, but also how government can influence the outcome for patients. So, for an example, one of the areas that's been controversial for some time is the regulatory area, and how patients who may be prepared to take some element of risk where the regulatory parties would not be so happy to take that risk. How does that work?
Yeah, it comes up quite a lot, to be honest. For most of the patients and families that we work with and support, there are no treatments for those conditions. So research is very much at the forefront of their mind and is very much the avenue they wish to take in terms of potentially having treatments for their condition. And I think one of the issues that we found is often patients say they're very keen to take part in research, but that sometimes the risks are perceived to be too great for them. But patients are actually asking, well, actually we think that this is okay and we would like to take part. So we undertook a piece of research, a project recently called Risks and Benefits, which sat down and really collected a group of patients who were interested in this area, and we used a citizens jury model to do the project, which meant that it was quite an intensive time. They spent 2 weekends together, and we brought in expertise from a whole host of different backgrounds. So, for example, from the EMA, from the MHRA, we also had researchers talking about their research and how they involve patients. And we sat down the patients afterwards so they could really discuss the issues, the complexities of the issues and the ethics around the issues as well, to come up with guidelines and sort of thoughts and information about really the patient perspective on this and what their views were. And one of the key findings from the report was that, for example, often regulatory bodies don't take into account some of the social issues, the psychosocial issues around taking part in research. For example, being able to take part in research can sometimes mean that the therapy they're undergoing can enable them to do other things in their life because their health improves slightly. So, and these issues maybe weren't considered very much. So the findings have been very useful. We're actually going to now do a second project looking at whether or not these findings are similar in patients across Europe as well.
Okay, and obviously that means you're going to work with your sister associations.
Exactly, yes.
In Europe as well.
Yes, there are Genetic Alliance, similar organisations across Europe. So yes, we'll be working with those organisations.
Okay, and the other element to this is another project is SWAN.
Yes.
Which is syndromes without a
name.
name. And tell us about that project.
Syndromes Without a Name, Swan UK, as it's called, is a big lottery-funded project. We have funding for 5 years to undertake this project, and it works with children with undiagnosed conditions. It originally came from one of our member organisations. A group did exist a few years ago, but sadly had to close because the lady was a grandmother and she was fairly elderly and wasn't able to continue. And really these families then had nowhere to go. They had no support group, and they didn't really fit into any of our other membership because they don't have a diagnosis yet.
Right.
What we suspect is that most of the conditions are genetic, and in fact most families have been seen by a geneticist and are very keen to carry on seeing genetics as time goes on, because as we've said, as research moves forward, new discoveries are there and diagnoses are made. In fact, we've already had one diagnosis from the project, and that family has moved to a different one of our members. But the project provides online support. There's a Facebook group, Twitter group. We've organised fun days. It's been very successful, and it's been lovely to see the families come together and find a home for undiagnosed children.
And gives them hope.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well. Jessica, going back to the toolkit, I believe that's going to be launched soon?
Yes, correct? It will be freely available on our website to any group or organisation that wishes to create their route maps, their own route map. We will be spreading it far and wide via our social media and through our partnerships and networks that we have ourselves.
And then will you then check those route maps when they've completed them, or they just go off and...
No, the idea behind the toolkit is that we've developed it so that it will empower the groups to build their own capacity, that they will be able to go out and ensure that the material they're using is referenced, and getting specialists and clinicians to review the medical information that they have written.
Right, and also presumably you can provide advice and consultation.
Yes, of course, we'll always be here to provide any support, and all of the pilot groups have all agreed to have their contact details included in the toolkit so that they can provide support based on their own experiences as well.
I suppose finally, Melissa, is for an organisation like yours, Genetic Alliance UK, how do you measure your success? How would you like to see your what sort of things do you like to have achieved over the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
I think in terms of our sort of achievements and successes, as a charity, it's often the long term. We often play the long game. I think one of the key things, for example, is very recently when the new Human Fertilisation Embryology Bill went through Parliament, we played a very active role in that. And actually, we were established back in 1990 when the first bill came through. And we were a very new organisation. We had 5 members, and we campaigned very much a grassroots. It was very sort of ad hoc, whereas now we're much more skilled in our campaigning. And we were actually mentioned in the responses from government as a contributor. I think also in terms of going forward, we have a plan for rare diseases in the pipeline from the Department of Health, which is something that we've campaigned very hard for over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think the plan for rare diseases will be published next year. This is a big achievement for Genetic Alliance UK and its campaign, Rare Disease UK. And I think it shows we've come a long way, and we can really influence proactively the government policy around genetics and rare diseases.
Melissa and Jessica, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show.
Thank you.